And again, I've written, for those who want to really dig into this, a lot of books. I've written 4 volumes of The Untold History of Canada and a 4-volume book series, like Stefan said, of The Clash of the Two Americas, going through the British-directed fifth columnists embedded within the United States since 1776, overseeing the murder of every single president, all 8 of them who died while in office since that time. So it's something people could chew on if they are inspired to after the course of this small presentation. So to begin quickly, a brief outline of today's British Commonwealth of 53 nations around the world, representing about 22% of the world's total surface area. As we can see there, these are all British Commonwealth members. There's British Commonwealth Games. India is still a member of that Commonwealth, although some of these nations are a little bit more independent than others. Despite that, they're all still locked into certain structures that never disappeared. Again, about 23% of the world's surface area is represented here. A lot of the most valuable diamond mines resources are located in the zone. And if we compare it to the thing that up until the early 30s, actually really till 1945, when the British began to prepare for its new rebranding after World War II. Well, let's compare the official British Empire at its largest expanse was representing about 23%, 23.5% of the world's surface area. And comparing it to the British Commonwealth today, the British Empire about a century ago, as we can see, not that different. It's not different enough. So let's just take that a little bit further. There's some things that, the new king that we have and all of our money in the Commonwealth, and especially the English white people part of the Commonwealth of nations, which is also the Five Eyes, the UK, Canada, USA, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, as well as the USA. The head of that is the sovereign, is King Charles III, who added this year to what was known as the Magna Carta. There was a whole grouping around the Privy Council in the UK that generated what's known as the Terra Carta, and what you see there on the right is the Astra Carta, basically with the logic or the philosophy that it is the British Empire or the British Commonwealth's obligation to be lead in the stewardship of the earth as a whole. So not just the British Commonwealth of 52 nations, but the earth as a whole, the global ecosystems. It is the British Commonwealth, with the head of said Commonwealth, the Privy Council, and whatever ruling monarch is also the head of the church, the Anglican Church, set up in 1534 by Henry VIII, with the God-man, whatever it is, this hereditary entity who would be the English sort of pseudo-pope, which Queen Elizabeth was, as King Charles is. That would be the stewards and managers of the stasis of ecosystems management in the post-globalization age. On the right, the Astra Carta was put forth about a month later, which, when you read this weird document, it calls for extending this logic of British, I would say colonial, yeah, sure, stewardship of the ecosystems of the earth to the eco-solar system of the universe. So very grandiose ambitions. And of course, when you actually read the Magna Carta itself, even though Westerners are often lied to by being told that this is what is at the heart of modern nation states and modern law, even the American Constitution, we are told, was rooted in the Magna Carta, it's actually not true. When you read the Magna Carta, it's largely a document put forth by the feudal lords of England that had taken over control during the Norman invasion, which is sort of a Viking-run invasion that installed feudalism for the first time in England since the Roman Empire. England had formerly been known as Roman Londinium. That was sort of the center of a big capital within the ancient Roman pagan empire during the Claudian invasion. And the center of that power structure in ancient Rome, it was the Temple of Isis. It was an Isis cult. It was an initiatory Magna Mater cult that ran in tandem with the various other dominant anti-Christian mystery cults of pagan Rome. The cult of Mithra being another major one that would operate in conjunction with the cult of Isis and Serapis, as well as a third one, which was the cult of Cybele and Attis. All three of them kind of had their distinguishing characteristics, but all were initiatory occult agencies that had a high priesthood that channeled messages from demons and gods to the elect. That was part of the organizing structure of the Roman Empire. And these were all the enemies of Christianity in the early years. So the Temple of Isis, the center of Isis, was Londinium. Londinium, in Roman Londinium, around 46 BC was when this was officially set up. The Temple of Isis location is in a place today known as the City of London. It's a square mile region, which I'm going to say a little bit more about later. This is very important, though. That square mile is sort of known. There's a movie called The Spider's Web that was done not too long ago. It's quite good, just to get across the extrajudicial power, the supra-sovereign power of the square mile, where it's today the financial center of the world, as it's been for a long time. It has its own juries, its own police force. It's very weird, but like I said, that location is where the core temple of Isis was 2,000 years ago. And the Magna Carta was created, and inside of it, it enshrines the sacred privileges of the City of London to be defended and maintained above the laws of the nation and above the laws of any nation. And that's part of the Magna Carta originally of the 13th century. So this expansion of this logic of a feudal oligarchical elite that does seem to go back to ancient times was enshrined philosophically within the Terra and Astra Cartas as well. So this is what Prince Charles represents, whether he knows it fully, or I don't know what he knows or doesn't know. I don't know. I'm going to admit that I have no idea what he knows. But he's got his own, he certainly has a sense of grandeur.
Jetzt bin ich da auf etwas drauf, das redet Englisch. Ich habe den Link aufgemacht.
Wissenschaftsgruppe.
All right, somebody needs to go in. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. And when he was made the king, part of that is he changed the oath or the title of the King of England from being defender of the faith, which it was under Henry VIII, to becoming defender of the faiths, as in all faiths on the earth. So he does see himself as being sort of a universal religious figure, kind of not that dissimilar from Pope Francis, both of whom played a role in the Great Reset since the very early stages of the Great Reset. And this is a little tweet. The first official tweet in June 3rd, 2020, announcing officially the terminology of the Great Reset was actually made, though many people don't know this, by King Charles, Prince of Wales himself, where he wrote, "As we move from rescue to recovery, we have a unique but rapidly shrinking window of opportunity to learn the lessons and reset ourselves to a more sustainable path. It is an opportunity we have never had before and may never have again. We must use all the levers we have at our disposal, knowing that each and every one of us has a vital role to play." What a great man. So he was actually assigned, and I don't think he was like I don't think he's a giant brain, but he was it's strange, it's interesting that he was the one assigned to announce the Great Reset. And he's been involved with the World Economic Forum since the 1970s, very closely with Klaus Schwab, as was his father, the founder of the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, Prince Philip, who, prolifically said how much he wants to be reincarnated as a deadly virus to solve overpopulation. That Prince Philip, that's Allgemeine Zeitung, that was a German newspaper that he gave that interview in the 80s. And again, his role as the founder of the World Wildlife for Nature and at times president of it is not to be ignored or as seen as something different. Keeping in mind also that Prince Philip founded this agency in 1961 alongside Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, a former Nazi SS officer, a misanthropic anti-humanist who founded the Bilderberger Group, that these two men founded that together, and that Prince Charles was the president of the British World Wildlife Fund, also should not be ignored or seen as something other than this thing that's being announced here at the World Economic Forum. So let's pull back a little bit here. in terms of who controls the resources, largely has a big influence over who controls the world. And today, this is a 2016 report called The New Colonialism. I found it a very useful report on Britain's scramble for Africa's energy mineral resources, just going through the Commonwealth controls of many African nations that have the biggest cobalt, rare earth, diamond, gold mines. That goes back to the days of Cecil Rhodes, who founded the Rhodes Trust, the Rhodes Scholarship Network, and created things like De Beers, Launerho, which are still today major diamond and resource magnates, cartels that control a big chunk of Africa's destiny, which Africa's been doing a pretty good job fighting it in recent years, but it's still a very nefarious influence. And in this report, I just took out one little observation, which is that 101 companies listed on the London Stock Exchange, most of them British, have mining operations in 37 sub-Saharan African nations. They collectively control over $1 trillion worth of Africa's most valuable resources. The UK government has used its power and influence to ensure that British mining companies have access to Africa's raw materials. This was the case during the colonial period and is still the case today. And again, when you look at the Australian, Canadian mining companies, hugely influential, Barrick Gold, other things. I mean, they're hugely influential in extracting wealth and artificially keeping Africa as poor as humanly possible, though this is the richest continent in the world on every standard one would choose to look, not just minerals, rare earths, lithium, cobalt, but you'd also want to look at soil fertility, fresh water. I mean, the amount of abundance and richness that could be created for Africa is incredible. So the amount of effort to keep Africa artificially in a dark age and at war with itself, this is not the natural destiny of Africa. There's a lot of foreign subversion over generations to make this happen. Some of the techniques or the infrastructure built up by the British Empire to do this involve things like what you're looking here is the homepage for Crown Agents Limited, an agency set up in the early 19th century, 1833, as a semi-private agency tied to the British East India Company originally, but it still exists, took on a few rebrandings, and they control energy grids in South Africa, across various African nations, Ukraine, medical infrastructure. They also control in Ukraine and a variety of other places across Africa. That's their specialty, but also in some places around Asia. It's funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is one of their funders, the UN. There's a pretty big nefarious list that is part of this Bilderberger group, sort of, weird multi-headed, pseudo-private, open society thing that's been utilized to subvert nations, especially over the last 50, 60 years. So this is an important thing that's often not on people's radar. You have entities like the Corps of Commissionaires, a British-run global mercenary force that carries out guns for hire operations to South American, African nations. Usually they work in tandem with narco-terrorists in South America, in Boko Haram and other terrorist agencies in Africa, funded by the CIA. That's one of the main infrastructure points is the Corps of Commissionaires, created in 1859, still exists, very influential, highly... I don't know whether you're not allowed to speak about this in polite society or what, but nobody does, even though it's not a secret thing. So it's weird. There's like these little mental electric fences, right, around people's minds when they go through university and find themselves working in think tanks or academia, that even smart people like John Mearsheimer, who says pretty useful things about, the Nazis in Ukraine or, things that are, I would say, useful to stopping World War III. Despite that, there's places he just cannot go. And I don't know whether it's a willful thing or whether it's just mental blinders. I don't know. Another point of evidence I'm just going to bring to the table as a point of consideration is the HSBC being caught with Bank Quds, two banks. The Bank Quds is the official bank of the royal family. They were caught red-handed in 2012 laundering hundreds of millions of dollars of drug money as part of their regular operations for a very long time. And the same, about a month later, you had on July 17th, 2012, Senator Carl Levin released a final report of their inquiry into HSBC, the Hongshang Bank of Commerce, created at the end of the Second Opium War by the British to help facilitate the flow of opium money and opium per se into China to destroy. That was part of the century of humiliation. So that Carl Levin report was made public, and it's called U.S. Vulnerabilities to Money Laundering, Drugs, and Terrorist Financing HSBC Case History, where Carl Levin proved that HSBC was the world's biggest drug bank still. What it was doing in 1865, it never stopped doing for 1 second. And that is not as many foolish American conservatives believe, and I say foolish because they see Hong Kong, Shanghai, and because most of these otherwise patriotic, nice people, because they're so misinformed about the world and history, they immediately think, oh, that's a Chinese bank. See, more proof that the Chinese are the enemies of America, out to destroy the United States. That's something I get a lot. I encounter this all the time. It's a London bank. It was created to destroy China and the United States. That's the point. It's a London bank. But they still control to this even though Hong Kong was returned to China by the British, which is still known as the CIA of the Pacific. Even though they were returned in 1997, HSBC even now still controls the issuance of 1/3 of the Hong Kong money, not the Chinese government, and Standard & Chartered, another British bank tied to speculation, economic warfare, controls the other 1/3. The Chinese only control 1/3 of the Hong Kong money. So another point just to keep in mind when we're thinking about, well, what is this thing called China or any nation? You can't understand what the dynamics of any nation are if you don't think about the unspeakable elements that are actual influences over different regions of the globe. So that's an important one. They were found guilty, and they had auditors placed in there for 5 years. Basically, one guy, assigned to oversee like a multi-trillion-dollar global operation like HSBC, who was supposed to somehow keep it under control. This guy was not equipped to do that. And as far as I could tell, HSBC still does what it always does. Returning back to Canada here. Another thing just for those watching this recording from Canada, but I think this is useful in general, is that, we heard this oath of office, this pledge by Justin Trudeau. I mentioned this is baked into our Canadian foundations. And indeed, when you look at the foundational documents of Canada per se, it literally says that the nation was set up for the benefit of the British Empire, not for the people or the nation. And I think even in the German Constitution and the Swiss constitutions, there's some idea that the purpose of the laws of the nation are to defend the people, the interests of the general welfare. Those are concepts that are present in every nation. That's an actual that merits the title of being an actual nation. Whereas in Canada, our founding document, the British North America Act of 1867, literally states in its preamble, whereas these provinces desire to be federally united into one dominion under the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, with a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom, and whereas such a union would conduce to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire. So it's very clear that the purpose is to advance the interests of the British Empire. And part of the sleight of hand here is that they say that this constitution is it's modeled on the Constitution of the United Kingdom. Now, legal scholars have pointed out that the United Kingdom has no constitution. It has centuries of random legal documents as part of the common law, very, very relativistic. It's law by precedent. Whoever can make an argument and win a case creates a precedent by which now a new set of standards can be created for future cases. There's no actual principle of law in the British philosophy. Highly liberal, highly based upon the power of sophistry, of rhetoric, of the will to power. not really based on any recognition that there are principles in the universe that we have to be obedient to that are constant. That's not there. And so we're modeling ourselves on something that actually doesn't exist. So it's like a shadow of a shadow, as Shakespeare might point out. One of the Lincoln admiring prime ministers, one of the few that we have had, was named Wilfrid Laurier, and he was ousted in a coup d'etat in 1911 because it was clear he was not going to allow Canada to get sucked into World War I, which was a foreign-directed war. Even today, most historians cannot give a meaningful reason why World War I even happened. The fact is, the only way to account for why World War I happened is to look at the role of British imperial geopolitical manipulations that conducted over years secret military treaties, mutual security pacts, not that dissimilar from NATO's collective security Article 5 tract or pact. But there were many things between England, France, and Russia that were done in secret that allowed for a situation such that when a catalyzing moment, in this case, it was an anarchist murder from a Serbian anarchist of some disposable archduke in Austria could be affected, a set of very terrible, unnecessary chain reactions, but very foreseeable for those who orchestrated the checkmate, were unleashed, resulting in Serbia's ally Russia being brought into a war with Austria's ally, Germany more broadly, into a wasting forever war that activated secret treaties that Germany didn't even know existed with France and England and Russia. So all of this stuff, none of that had to happen. But Wilfrid Laurier was not going to allow that sort of thing for Canada to get pulled in, and so he was ousted. He was doing a few other very interesting things that I don't have time for here, but he was ousted by an operation run by certain Freemasonic Orangemen in Ontario. And he made a point after he was ousted where he wrote during World War I to one of his allies that Canada is now governed by a junta sitting in London known as the Round Table, with ramifications in Toronto, in Winnipeg, and Victoria, with Tories and Grits receiving their ideas from London and insidiously forcing them onto their respective parties. So that's already somebody making the point that a foreign agency is taking control, named the Round Table, of both parties in Canada. Now, this round table was set up by Cecil Rhodes, who I mentioned earlier, the diamond magnate who created Rhodesia in today's Zimbabwe, but a big chunk of South Africa. That was Rhodesia. He was a racist, a race patriot, as they called him, but he also created, through his vast fortunes from stealing from Africa, a massive amount of money, which funded a new set of think tanks that were brought online, set up around the world, first through the British Commonwealth, known as roundtable groups in different parts, including in the USA. In the USA, it came in through an agency known as the Pilgrim Society, set up in 1902, and a new program to indoctrinate young talent from around the world in the halls of Oxford, who could then be sent back after having received their Rhodes scholarships into their respective country to begin a long-term penetration of every institution that has influence: academic, governmental, military, media, private, corporate, whatever. And they would work in tandem with another think tank known as the Fabian Society that was founded a little bit earlier, that had a little bit more of a socialist veneer, but operated by the same eugenicists and anti-humanists, of which Bertrand Russell was a member for a time, H.G. Wells, Lord Mackinder, Halford Mackinder, the founder of geopolitics, was a member, George Bernard Shaw, and many, many others. Lord Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, was a member of the Fabian Society. And again, using the logic of the techniques of Emperor Fabius Quintus Maximus, the Roman general and consul during the Second Punic War, the idea was be patient, use attrition, don't fight your enemy head on, penetrate. And the permeation theory was what was also adopted by the Round Table movement. So this is what Laurier himself, the prime minister, was calling out as having taken over and having run the coup against him that ousted him in 1911. a leading roundtabler was named Lord Lothian. He was ambassador to Washington for the UK for a period. He was part of what are known as Milner's kindergarten. Lord Alfred Milner was the Minister of Colonies, very powerful position. He was also a co-architect of the Balfour Accords that established what became the State of Israel later on. And this was done in forgetting here, I think 1917. So Lord Milner, Lord Balfour, Lloyd George, another roundtabler, along with Walter Rothschild, were all architects of the what became Zionism in the state of Israel. Now, ironically, what should be held in mind is all of these individuals, with the exception of Walter de Rothschild, were all anti-Semitic. They hated the Jews. They were all anti-Semites. They were all pro-fascist. So go figure. Why were they so devoted emotionally, intellectually to carving out of British Mandate Palestine a zone to convince all of the Jews of the world to go and live? Was there a higher geopolitical agenda behind this on the game board? And I would say yes. Now, one thing, though, is that at the time, America still had some sovereign impulse, was not playing along with this idea of a global world government under British control. And that includes British banking control. A lot of Americans were still very, very patriotic and still had a living memory of people like William McKinley, who was murdered in 1901, who was a Lincoln Republican president. Lincoln himself, people were still alive who remembered Lincoln before he was murdered, and Garfield, another Lincoln president, murdered in 1880. So there was a different tradition than what we have today that was still much more active in America, that was pissing off a lot of these roundtablers who were trying to penetrate more deeply controls of Washington, and they were having trouble. And Lord Lothian, I thought, put this pretty well in a letter to Philip Kerr. Oh no, I'm forgetting. There's another roundtabler. Anyway, he said here that there is a fundamentally different concept in regard to this question between Great Britain and the United States as to the necessity of civilized control over the politically backward peoples. Imperialism. The inhabitants of Africa and parts of Asia have proved unable to govern themselves. Yet America not only has no conception of this aspect of the problem, but has been led to believe that the assumption of this kind of responsibility is iniquitous imperialism. So he's actually saying that it's problematic that the Americans are antagonistic to imperialism, but he needs them to accept the white man's burden, because the idea is to create an Anglo-American special relationship to bring America into harmony with their Anglo-Saxon racial brethren in England to co-control the world together. So there's this tradition in America that's resistant. So the Roundtable movement, what do? After World War I, they have effected a coup d'etat in England itself. They've ousted Herbert Asquith, the prime minister, in 1916, and there's a book written on this, with Lord Milner being the grand architect of the ouster of Asquith and the installation of Lloyd George, who later becomes a pro-Nazi minister of England. But he becomes prime minister, overseeing not just World War I, but really what they really wanted was for the Round Table to control the solutions to World War I, which was one world government, with the logic that because we allowed sovereign nation states to exist, they create war and the only solution is one world government, right? A non-elected elite of scientific managers who will be untainted by electoral considerations to impose scientific management of our limited resources. And that's where the League of Nations was created in 1919 to be that solution. Also, the Roundtable created what's known as Chatham House, or the Royal Institute for International Affairs, as their new think tank in America. And this was created in 1919 at the Versailles Conference. At that same meeting, they also created, and this is where the Versailles debt repayments were imposed onto Germany at that same moment. In America, they created at that same time a think tank known as the Council on Foreign Relations, which became the American branch of the Roundtable movement. Chatham House in London being, or the Royal Institute in London being the the mother of the motherships. This is what Hillary Clinton called the mothership in 2009. But the problem was, due to a nationalist patriotic sentiment of very smart people from both sides of the aisle in Canada, in the United States, in some parts of Europe, mostly in Ireland, but also in Russia, in China, in India. Well, not in India at the time, but in China, in Russia, in some parts of Austria. There was a non-willingness to give up sovereignty to this global body. And so by 1923-24, it became clear the League of Nations efforts at a one world government under eugenics scientific priesthood was failing. It did fail. They tried again in 1933 with the London Economics and Monetary Conference to solve the Great Depression, with the idea that the Bank of England and the City of London and the League of Nations were going to be the replacement for sloppy decision making. And it was only because of the United States under Franklin Roosevelt, who pulled the United States out of the delegation, out of all of the meetings, that the whole conference was torpedoed after several months. So that subverted the second effort in the 20th century to have a one world government under a new world order. And then they had to try again with a little bit more of an aggressive push now by putting forth their more brute force Nazi fascist battering ram, which manifested in a lot of what became World War II. But that also failed when it was becoming clear that the Nazis were not quite, or that Hitler's generals were putting forth a strategy that was risking rendering England and the Anglo-American pro-fascists. And again, I speak of King Edward the Eighth, the pro-Nazi king who taught Queen Elizabeth the Hitler salute. And, you had many fascists in America, like, Mussolini and Hitler were on Times Magazine like 18 times. So it was really being promoted as the economic miracle solution to all of our economic problems, fascism. But they were running the risk of becoming junior partners in the New World Order. And Hitler, following the advice of some of his generals, had the idea of becoming the senior partners, which only some British imperialists and American imperialists wanted to go along with. Other ones thought that was not a sacrifice they were willing to make at that time. And so they ended up putting down their Frankenstein monster with the idea that they could reorganize and live to fight another day and carry out their New World Order attempt, perhaps if they think a little bit more multi-generationally. And this is where you had in 1944 an effort led by Lord Maynard Keynes of the Fabians to bring about a one world currency under the Bancorp at the Bretton Woods Conference, under the Bank of England control, which failed. And then, we had what I'm about to say. Franklin Roosevelt has been highly slandered by some and misrepresented by even those who like him. So even many Democrats today who think that they like him, they actually like a fake image of him that they don't even know, which is why they support things like the Green New Deal, thinking that it's like a carryover of what was done by the first New Deal in the 1930s and 40s. That's actually not true. And I'm going to say a little something about that. But Franklin Roosevelt was a Lincoln American, a Lincoln patriot, even though he was a Democrat, and his policies very much inspired John F. Kennedy, who was trying to revive his program, which involved a war against Wall Street and the City of London at the same time as it was reviving a constitutional banking process through what's known as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It was sort of he used this agency like a national bank to provide loans for businesses, enterprises, as well as the basically activity that created amazing amounts of job and increased the productive powers of labor by building, electrification grids across the backwards, ignorant, illiterate Tennessee Valley area, the South, which was still ignorant and racist. And he transformed this through careful planning, but also that was not just totalitarian or state-directed. It was based on a synergy with a huge blossoming of private enterprises as well as national power. So both of these things were growing at the same time. It's not an antagonism if it's done a certain way. And this is, again, what JFK was inspired by. Now, he said to his son, who was also his personal assistant, at the end of World War II was winding down, He said that, you know, any number of times the men in the State Department have tried to conceal messages to me, delay them, hold them up somehow, just because some of those career diplomats over there are not in accord with what they know I think. They should be working for Winston, that is Winston Churchill. As a matter of fact, a lot of the time they are working for Churchill. Stop to think of them. Any number of them are convinced that the way for America to conduct its foreign policy is to find out what the British are doing and then copy that. I was told 6 years ago to clean out the State Department. It's like the British Foreign Office. Very interesting statement that he made before he dies in a very premature way. He also said in another discussion, I think this is at Yalta, again, his son recorded this in a book called As He Saw It, published in 1946, after his father had died. He records a discussion he had with his father at Yalta saying, I am talking about another war, Elliot. I'm talking about what will happen to our world if, after this war, we allow millions of people to slide back into the same semi-slavery. Don't think for a moment, Elliot, that Americans would be dying in the Pacific tonight if it hadn't been for the short-sighted greed of the French and the British and the Dutch. Shall we allow them all to do it again? All over again? Your son will be about the right age 15 or 20 years from now. One sentence, Elliot, then I'm going to kick you out of here. I'm tired. And he's going to bed that night. This is the sentence. When we've won the war, I will work with all my might and main to see to it that the United States is not wheedled into the position of accepting any plan that will further France's imperialistic ambitions or that will aid or abet the British Empire in its imperial ambitions. Very clear statement of intention here. But he dies. April 12th, 1945, he's dead, right? No autopsy. Nobody has an idea. He was just elected. And instead, an Anglophile idiot, a proto-George Bush Jr. type of character is brought in to replace him in the form of Harry Truman, who invites Winston Churchill to practically live in the White House in these early sensitive periods in 1946, 45 to 46. And what happens? You know, you have Wallace first Henry Wallace, the vice president, is replaced with Truman. So Truman's infused in there. Roosevelt dies. Again, no autopsy. So people say natural death. I'm sorry, no autopsy was done. And in fact, Stalin had his own people investigate this. And Stalin was convinced till the last days of his life that Winston Churchill's people poisoned Roosevelt, and told that to Elliot, who interviewed Stalin about this. 1945, nuclear bombs dropped on a defeated Japan. Japan was effectively defeated. It was just their supply lines were cut off. It was just a matter of when. And there was backdoor negotiations being run through Rome between the Japanese and the West. And despite that, the decision was made to drop bombs onto a defeated Japan as a sort of testament or a message to former allies of America like China and Russia and others, to say, okay, the new game in town is not the Roosevelt vision for U.S., Russia, China cooperation. The new game in town is Anglo-American hegemony. September 20th, 45, the OSS is disbanded. All of the patriots are purged. 1946, Iron Curtain speech by Churchill. The Cold War is launched. Same day, Churchill also co-signs the UK-USA signals agreement tying the GCHQ and the NSA together in a intelligence dragnet that soon brings in Canada and other members. That this becomes the Five Eyes. And on September 1947, the CIA, under British direction, is now reconstituted as America's new intelligence agency with fully Anglo-American ambitions behind it. Churchill states in his speech that neither the sure prevention of war nor the continuous rise of world organization will be gained without what I have called the fraternal association of the English-speaking peoples. This means a special relationship between the British and Commonwealth and Empire and the United States. That's the special relationship again. Henry Wallace makes a point. He's the former vice president, a good man. Before he's fired, he's still Secretary of Commerce, and he writes that fascism in the post-war inevitably will push steadily for Anglo-Saxon imperialism and eventually towards war with Russia. Already American fascists are talking and writing about this conflict and using it as an excuse for their internal hatreds and intolerances towards certain races, creeds, and classes. So he's already talking about this takeover that FDR was aware of this foreign, agency that was pushing fascism. And this was also behind the growth of the KKK, all of the Jim Crow laws and other things. That was what was pushing that domestically, while at the same time preparing for war. The IMF is taken over. So these Bretton Woods institutions that were supposed to be conduits for global development are now hijacked. Henry Dexter White dies when he's campaigning for Henry Wallace for president in 1948, and he was the only human being who led the IMF. At that point, the IMF, as well as the World Bank, became agencies for neo-colonial reconquest. You have the NSC 75, which is a directive to save the British Empire in July 1950. That's a U.S. policy that says, well, now that communism is supposed to be our enemy, now if the British Empire nations become independent, they might ally with the communists. And so that means it is now in America's interests to save the British Empire's control over its colonies who might want to be independent. So that all of a sudden became part of America's security doctrine, that's a toxic sin. Clement Attlee, who replaces Churchill, gives a bold warning. He's probably one of the few decent prime ministers of the UK, where he says over and over again, we have seen that there is another power than that which has its seat at Westminster. The City of London, a convenient term for a collection of financial interests, is able to assert itself against the government of the country. Those who control money can pursue a policy at home and abroad contrary to that which is being decided by the people. A few examples of some of these Rhodes Scholars who managed the Cold War, I think, are useful to keep in mind. You have got people like George McGee. You got, a variety. Escott Reed, the founder, a Canadian Rhodes Scholar who founded NATO, or who created the framework for NATO 2 years before NATO was created. Dean Rusk, who orchestrated the Korean War, as well as the U.S. support for France and Vietnam, and then the Vietnam War, as a Rhodes Scholar, trained in Oxford. Senator William Fulbright, who also created a Fulbright scholarship program, very influential in the United States, was a Rhodes Scholar, a big promoter of basically globalization. Also, William Yandell Elliott, the guy in the middle, he ran the Chatham House of Harvard, and he was the mentor of Sir Henry Kissinger. Kissinger being a guy who was knighted by Her Majesty the Queen and made a member of the Order of St. Michael and St. George in 1993 for works for the British, basically benefiting the British Empire. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, a Fabian Society manager and puppet, was also trained by William Yandell Elliott. Zbigniew Brzezinski was a Yandell Elliott boy, as well as Samuel P. Huntington, who put forth the Clash of Civilizations, was also indoctrinated by Yandell Elliott. Oliver Stone's son, Sean Stone, wrote a really good book called The New World Order in 2016, which really focuses on William Yandell Elliott per se, and I think it's a super useful book for people to purchase. It's available online. There was a period of fight back against this imperial takeover from many nations. In Italy, you had Enrico Mattei, who was assassinated in 1960, but he was a real Christian, who fought for African development, utilizing his control over Italy's most powerful energy company to push for large-scale, full-spectrum development and industrial development for the poor countries of the world that had been destroyed by colonialism. You had Ulf Sandmark. Charles de Gaulle. You had Bobby Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, Patrice Lumumba, many leaders who were assassinated or just run out of power by CIA, MI6 run regime change during this period of the 1960s to early 70s. Even King Faisal in 75, right, of Saudi Arabia, who was an admirer of John F. Kennedy and had a plan for the industrial development of Saudi Arabia, was killed by a Muslim Brotherhood operation that had been created as a Islamist grouping by British Freemasonic agencies when Britain was controlling Egypt, and still had influence over the region. So this is the Muslim Brotherhood. This is what spawned all radical Islamist ideologies like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, that had also received a lot of government support from the USA under Zbigniew Brzezinski and Kissinger. in order to weaken the Soviet Union in the 80s. This is Operation Cyclone. And last three slides here, then I'll just round it out. It speeds up now. What happens to the United States over the dead body of Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr. is a vicious, vicious takeover steered by the Bilderberger Group, like I said, that had been created by Prince Bernhard earlier in the 50s. And you have the first point in this short, dense period of 1971 is the Inter-Alpha Group under Lord Jacob Rothschild is created, sort of with each of the member banks of the Inter-Alpha Group has a penetration into strategic countries of Europe to create this multi-headed beast with a lot of influence to push deregulation of nations, which is what happens. And 1971, same month, the World Economic Forum is founded by a protege of Henry Kissinger named Klaus Schwab, as well as he was also a student of Maurice Strong, another co-founder of this thing. Maurice Strong being a Canadian oligarch, a toy of David Rockefeller, and largely a godfather of the Green New Deal, if you ask me. And 1971, August 15th, you have the US dollar is now floated onto the floating exchange rates. That's a big one. That's what allows for the creation of the consumer society. Before that, there was an industrial model of society where money circulation and money behavior, investment and purchasing power, everything was tied to activity that was generally associated with measurable productive output in agro-industrial systems. So you could only justify having more money in circulation in that pre-1971 system, which includes Europe, if there was some associated increase of the powers of productivity that were measurable by the real world. When the US dollar was floated from fixed exchange rates and onto the floating rates, then all of a sudden, random speculative activity became the determining value of what was going to determine the price of the US dollar or any commodity associated with said dollar, which got really bad with the petrodollar creation in 1973 by Kissinger largely. So this was a trilateral commission agency that transformed the U.S. from an industrial viable economy, and I would say all of the transatlantic community, into increasingly a deregulated consumer society focused more and more on speculating on myopic activities on the spot markets, futures markets, with no regard for the real world consequences of that type of casino logic. No more large-scale planning, no more advanced science, no more leaping over the limits to growth. And like I said, 1973, the Trilateral Commission now is fully founded. And Kissinger, who runs this with David Rockefeller and Zbigniew, literally states that hold on, I gotta move my little thing here because it's covering my words. He says here that the British were so matter-of-factly helpful that they became a participant in internal American deliberations to a degree probably never practiced between sovereign nations. In my White House incarnation, then, I kept the British Foreign Office better informed and more closely engaged than I did the American State Department. It was symptomatic. What the hell is that? This is Kissinger speaking in May 10th, 1981, to the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the roundtable movement in the UK, also known as Chatham House. He's literally speaking to his British controllers, telling them that while he was Secretary of State, he spent more time keeping the British Foreign Office better informed than his own State Department. And people wonder why he was knighted by the Queen, along with George Bush Sr., the former head of the CIA and Trilateral, who was also made a Knight of the Order of St. Michael and St. George around the same time as Kissinger was. So people wonder why that happened. And then think back to what did FDR actually warn his son, right? And the last thing here is, I think Jacob Rothschild, who is at the head of the Inter-Alpha Group, and I don't believe that this is a Rothschild-generated conspiracy, although he is a very powerful mercenary with his family for something higher that brought him into play a couple of centuries ago, or his family. But he says here in 1983 that two broad types of giant institutions, the worldwide financial service company and the international commercial bank with a global trading competence, may converge to form the ultimate all-powerful, many-headed financial conglomerate. And so here he's talking in 1983 about what becomes the Big Bang in London, the universalization of banking under Thatcher, or what becomes the takedown of Glass-Steagall in America in 1999 under Clinton, a Rhodes Scholar. Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar, as was like 30 members of the Clinton government were Rhodes Scholars. Strobe Talbot and Robert Reich and Derek Scherer and Kevin Thome, the chief of staff of the White House, and George Stephanopoulos, the communications director, Bruce Reed, who's still there handling Biden today. Biden has many Rhodes Scholars controlling and managing him and the White House today. This is what they did when they destroyed Glass-Steagall, is they destroyed all of the separations in banking activity to allow a multi-headed conglomerate to have universal banking and thus more power and influence than any sovereign nation state, which also coincided with the Austrian school economics, the liberalization of the economy, getting rid of regulation, getting rid of national influence over protectionism. All of this was illegalized by this Keynesian, von Hayek, Friedman, after post-Keynesian, von Hayek, Friedman deregulation of the global banking system to allow now these private these were like colonial rapists to be able to gain control of all of the nations of the world. And I seem to have a last slide. I don't know what I did here. And yeah, this, like I said, unipolar end of history, right? So the idea was get rid of, Big Bang. You have a near collapse of the economy. Derivatives then are normalized by another trilateral commission stooge named Greenspan. Derivatives become the new weapon of mass destruction. Today, they're 40 times the world GDP. It's a bomb that was set to collapse. The world economy was designed to collapse in that sense. And here's an example of some of the derivatives. They far outweighed, this is JP Morgan alone. This is the US derivatives. JP Morgan has almost $100 trillion. There's at least $708 trillion of derivatives. In the United States, this doesn't also include Europe. It probably is upwards of $1.5 quadrillion. And the collapse of the real economy is measurable, where real economy has a balance of services as well as manufacturing. Our economy is purely services and financial services, especially. Last one here, Putin, and then I'll stop. He made a point a couple of years ago. I think he said it well, so I'll just end it with this. He says that only sovereign states can effectively respond to the challenges of the times and the demands of the citizens. Accordingly, any effective international order should take into account the interests and capabilities of the state and proceed on that basis and not try to prove that they should not exist. Furthermore, it is impossible to impose anything onto anyone, be it the principles underlying the sociopolitical structure or values that someone, for their own reasons, has called universal. After all, it is clear that when a real crisis strikes, there is only one universal value left, and that is human life, which each state decides for itself how best to protect based on its abilities, culture, and traditions.